the battle, after the Battle of Salamis, Salamis was a navy battle in which the better equipped Greek navy ships defeated the Persian ships. I mean, you know, if you know anything about Greece, Greece has a very, very rugged coastline, which means it has a lot of harbors, and the people there were, well, they were very much into sailing, more so than were the Persians. Now, Persia has a sea coast, but most of Persia was not near the sea, and Persia doesn't have nearly as many harbors, so the Persians were not as good of fighters on the sea as were the Greeks. So at the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks won. Then the Greeks engaged the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. The Greeks were better soldiers, man for man. They fought with more discipline, and they were better equipped and better armed. And they defeated the Persians and sent the Persians home in defeat. It was the last time that Persia was ever to invade Greece, and that applies to this day. Well, the city of Athens had been torn apart, so Athens got together with some of the cities and formed the Delian League. Basically, the Delian League was a league of city-states that said to each other, we're going to prepare for the next invasion by Persia, which never happened, but so they agreed to pay their tribute money to Athens. And since the Persian invasion never happened, Athens used the tribute money to rebuild their city. And Athens built its beautified its city. They built the Acropolis, built the Parthenon, built Mars Hill, and built some magnificent temples to some of their gods. Never has a city hardly ever been able to beautify itself at the expense of other cities. When some of the city-states said, hey, we want to get out of this Delian League, it's expensive, Athens wouldn't let them. It was like when a bunch of states joined our union back in the late 1700s, and some states said, that, hey, we want out. The federal government said, well, we can't let you out. They didn't let them out. A long war was fought about that, but Athens would not let any of them out. Now, not every city-state joined the Delian League. There was another league called the Peloponnesian League. This one was led by Athens. This league was led by Sparta. It was cheaper to join a Peloponnesian League. The Spartans were not into luxury and magnificent temples and things like that. All right. The greatest statesman perhaps that Greece ever had was a man named Pericles. He came on the scene shortly after the Persians retreated. He had to stand up for election every year, but he won the elections 29 out of 30 times. One time he was defeated for just knocked out of power for maybe for one year, but otherwise, he made Athens into a very powerful and wealthy city, and the other Greek cities became alarmed. And they said, hey, Athens is becoming too powerful. So a bunch of the other Greek city-states that had not aligned themselves in the Delian League formed a Peloponnesian League, and now Greece was in two camps, Athens and Sparta. At one point, the Spartans said to Pericles, hey, don't build walls because walls will make the city of Athens too powerful. Pericles said to them, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll go to your city and I'll discuss it with you. So Pericles left Athens, went to Sparta, but he told his officials, high officials, I want you to work on the walls day and night, and when you get the walls finished, send a message to me. So while Pericles was pretending to agree with the Spartans, the people of Athens were working to build the walls day and night, round the clock. When the walls were finished, some runner came, champion runner, informed Pericles the walls were finished. Pericles said to the Spartan king, goodbye, headed back to Athens, and the Spartans learned that the walls were already finished while Pericles was busy acting like he was agreeing with them. Kind of a shabby trick, to say the least, and you might say eventually Pericles was to pay for that. Well, inevitably, want to say inevitably this conflict led to war. The war is known as the Peloponnesian War. Because it was fought, well, the Peloponnesians were the enemies. I mean, a lot of times people name a certain war after the enemies. I mean, like in our history, we had the French and Indian War because the French and Indians were the enemies, so we call that war the French and Indian War. And well, we have another war we call the Mexican War because the enemy was a Mexican. So it was named after one side. It was called the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian League was led by Sparta. The Delian League was led by Athens, which in turn was led by Pericles. The conflict reminds me a lot of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that went on when I was a youngster. And it was kind of alarming to me because, I mean, in my day, we knew the Soviet Union had 3 times more submarines than we did. They had an army that was about 3 times the size of ours. They had about 2 or 3 times more battleships than we did. But then we later learned half their submarines were dysfunctional. Their tanks, half of them were in repair shop all the time. They were very difficult. It took months to repair them. And same way with their aircraft. Most of their aircraft were primitive. I mean, one of those submarines sunk one time in the Pacific, and one of our billionaires, Howard Hughes, raised it up and looked inside and think, this thing is primitive. And one day, in the case of the Russians, one Russian pilot decided he didn't want to be a Russian anymore, so he flew to Japan. The Russians said, give us back our pilot and plane. In Japanese said, we'll give you back your plane. We're not going to give you back the pilot. They gave it back the plane after they had gone through every inch of it and taken photographs and a diagram about, hey, this aircraft is primitive. Now, that might not be true today, folk, but it was true 30 and 40 years ago. But anyway, back to the time period we're talking about. I have to say, it looks to me like the bad guys won. I mean, I'll tell you right up front who won. The war was to last 20 years, and it ended with a big defeat for Athens. But at the beginning, of course, of a war, nobody knows who's going to win. Each side thinks they're going to win. Athens relied on its navy. Sparta relied on its highly trained army. Sparta did not have a seacoast, so Sparta did not have a navy. They fought for a year. Both sides won a few battles. So it was indecisive. At the end of the first year, I mean, they quit fighting in the wintertime. So Pericles called a big funeral service for the dead. And there's an opening vignette in your book about the speech he made where he praised how wonderful democracy was. I mean, this is where the chapter opens up with a vignette of Pericles. There was a funeral oration. And for democracy. All right. Athens was pretty much at the height here. I mean, okay, the first part of the war, each side still thought they could win. But the Spartan troops at the end of the winter surrounded the city of Athens, so Athenians were forced inside. And something that's always can happen that's unpredictable. A plague broke out inside Athens. It did not affect the Spartans because they did not mix with the Athenians. I mean, there was a battle, a war going on. The plague carried away a high percentage of Athenian men, ultimately including Pericles himself. Now, I want to digress just a little bit to give you some insight into the personal life of Pericles. As a very young man, Pericles had an illegitimate son. And he believed, as did the assembly, that illegitimate sons should not inherit. Well, when the plague broke out, a lot of persons had lost their sons. A lot of the rich. And they would go before the assembly and argue before the Council of 500 that let an illegitimate son inherit my estate. Pericles staunchly opposed, no illegitimate sons should not inherit your estate. Only the sons of a lawful wedded union. Well, first Pericles' oldest son died. Pericles believed that a leader should never show emotion, so he maintained what you call a stiff upper lip, no crying. The folk, I'm not in any way advocating this. This is now known to be very wrong. He did not cry for his oldest son. Let him be buried. Then his youngest son, the only son he had left, died. And at their funeral, Pericles completely lost control of his emotions and just broke out and cried uncontrollably. Then Pericles himself went before the same council of 500 and asked if illegitimate sons could not inherit the estate if there were no legitimate sons left. The assembly said, well, hey, you've always taken the other side before. What's your problem now? And they turned him down. And this is, this gives you some idea of the type of lives these people were leading and some of the things that was going on in a democracy. Now, shortly after that, Pericles died. His estate went to a near relative and not to his offspring. He had no grandchildren. All right, folks, I want to digress very personally. When I was 17, my parents took me 30 miles to make a speech. The title of the speech was Democracy, What It Means to Me. My dad approved of it, and I got up and gave a speech. I mean, I was champion of my school, so I went to another school. The title was Democracy. That was in 1967, 49 years ago. Today, I have to tell you, I've seen American democracy take such turns here in the last 47 years that I have to tell you, I no longer believe in democracy. If anybody wants to make a comment, you can. Inevitably, democracy leads on a path of deep, super deep indebtedness. And on a path of destruction, the only reason it survived this long was the American democracy had the good fortune of growing up where that our enemies were all, except for the American Indians who lived among us at first, the enemies were all thousands of miles away. I mean, our enemy, Great Britain, was 4,000 miles across the ocean. But I wanted to tell you something. During every one of our big wars, our democracy has been suspended. Abe Lincoln imprisoned people without a reason other than he feared they might be dissenters. He suspended our democracy for 4 years. You can check the records. He suspended habeas corpus, suspended the right to free speech. Woodrow Wilson jailed people who disagreed with the war. And one of the people he jailed was Eugene Debs. While in prison, Eugene Debs got 1 million votes. I'm saying it because if somebody says that we've never voted for a presidential candidate in prison before, we might be voting for another presidential candidate who's in prison this year. Yeah, this year. We might. I don't know that. But one time, a man in prison got 1 million votes. His name was Eugene Debs. Franklin Roosevelt suspended democracy in World War II, and so did Winston Churchill in Britain. Because you can't, I mean, here's what John Paul Jones said on board the ship. He called the crew together. Now, you all know the principles for which we are fighting. But regardless of the principles that we are fighting for, we can have none of those principles here on board this ship. On board this ship, I'm boss, and my orders will be obeyed without question. End of conversation. That's war, folk. The democracy's got a bad name because, well, we're going to study more about democracy when we come to Roman history. Democracies have a tendency to eventually get taken over by a benevolent-like type or seemingly benevolent dictator when people get tired of having punk kids knock over their mailboxes or smash out their windshields or break the antennas off their cars. They start demanding some kind of order and some kind of law. Socrates, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, Socrates himself said, when people have too much freedom, they eventually demand that freedoms be curtailed. One of his more famous quotes. All right. Anyway, the second year of the war, plague struck. The Athenians had to sign a truce that was greatly in Sparta's favor. But during the truce, the Athenian assembly got together and voted to go to war against Sicily. Now, when I was in the National Guard, a friend of mine loaned me a book about this war, the war that when Athens went to Sicily. And I remember reading about it in graduate school. Oh, it was a terrible, horrible, awful time for the Athenians. Every Athenian soldier, from the generals to the privates who went to Sicily, was either killed or sold into slavery. No one came home. The Athenians nevertheless engaged in another war with Sparta. Well, Sparta attacked them because Sparta said, hey, you violated a treaty by sending an army to Sicily, which you shouldn't have. So Sparta attacked again. And Athens continued to fight, but eventually Athens was thoroughly defeated. The Spartans moved in, destroyed every ship in Athens' navy, and tore down the walls and flattened the city of Athens. They left the beautiful buildings, fortunately. They left the Parthenon, left Mars Hill, left the Acropolis. They did not, but they did tear down the walls and left Athens basically terribly destitute, to which Athens took a long time to recover. Well, everybody thought that Sparta was going to unite with the Greeks. But Sparta was having its problems. I mean, any city that kills a high percentage of its babies, who's trains its young people so vigorously that a lot of them die during the training, and then any city that taxes its parents so heavily that the parents can't afford to have children, is bound to lose its population, and Sparta was no exception. In the war between Athens and Sparta, while Sparta initially won, another city came into, called Thebes. The Thebians did something that was unthinkable to the Spartans. The Thebians changed their military tactics a little bit. All right, the big weakness of the Hoplite formation was, while everybody was fighting to protect their buddy, if you could get around their flank. Well, the Theban general decided, instead of putting my men 4 deep on a flank, I'm going to put my men on the Sparta's flank 50 men deep. I mean, the Spartans, everybody, to protect their flank, put their best, most crack troops on a flank. But the Thebians were 50 deep, and the Spartans were only like the standard 4 deep. The 50 men, I mean, I'm talking 50 men, one behind the other. The 50 men deep army crushed the Spartan flank, and then the Spartans got hammered from behind. The Spartan general, and here's where the Spartans trained their men too well. The Spartan general saw what was happening, so he ordered a retreat. I mean, the purpose of the retreat, folk, was simply, I want you men to pull back, and once you pull back, we're going to reform and fight again. All right, it doesn't sound like a bad move. I mean, just reorganize your men, except for one thing. Half the Spartan armed men said, retreat? We have never retreated before, and we're not going to retreat now. So half of them retreated, half of them didn't. The half of them didn't got mauled. Sparta was forced to sue for peace with the Thebans. For the first time in its history, except for the case of the Persians, exactly, the first time in history, Sparta had been defeated by an army of Greeks. Well, this was to go on for the next 70 years, while nobody could really win, because Thebes itself, no sooner they defeated the Spartans than they ran into problems. Then Athens revived, and they began to reassemble, and then Corinth, another city-state, became powerful. You had 4 powerful cities now, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, and none of them could become strong enough to reunite Athens. Now, eventually, Athens was, not Athens, strong enough to unite Greece. Now, eventually, Greece was united. A foreigner came in. Now, the Macedonians, Macedonia, by the way, still exists as a country today. The Macedonians were related to the Greeks. They served the same gods. The Greeks looked on them as being barbarians, said, of the barbarians, they're the most like us. Now, folks, this is a natural tendency that all people have to think that we're better than everybody else. So the Greeks, I believe, they were the top. And next to them in rank were the Macedonians, who were part Greeks. But they were still outsiders. Nevertheless, Philip of Macedon got together a very powerful army, and he conquered Greece and united them for the first time since possibly the Minoan times. At this point, we'll leave the political history of Greece for a time and discuss their religion and philosophy. Religion. The Greeks believed that their gods lived on Mount Olympus. Now, folk, they believed that their gods lived, you might say, in the spiritual realm. Now, yes, they had climbed the top of Mount Olympus. And, of course, Mount Olympus is continually surrounded by clouds. But they believed that the gods had a way to get around, you might say, around the corner, and where they were, at least, well, we might almost say another dimension. But they believed their gods had their dwelling at a beautiful, beautiful heaven on top of Mount Olympus. They practiced animal sacrifice. We do not know if they ever practiced human sacrifice or not. We know that in India for a time they did, but the Greeks practiced animal sacrifice throughout much of their history. Their chief god was Zeus. Originally now, their chief god had been Uranus. But Uranus was overthrown by his son Saturn, and then Saturn was overthrown by Zeus. Zeus had two brothers, one brother named Hades, and another one, the Romans called him Pluto. I mean, the Greeks and Romans had different names for the same gods. In Roman mythology, Zeus was Jupiter. Zeus was a god of lightning. He was a chief. To honor Zeus, the Greeks held Olympic Games every 4 years. The winner of the Olympic Games was given an olive leaf, an olive crown, for his victory. And you competed in several events, most of which was foot racing, but also there was a javelin throw, and I believe possibly what we might call a long jump and a high jump. I don't know what all events they competed in, but the winner, at the end, when it's all over with, there was one winner. The Olympic Games was supposedly helped keep the Greeks fit for the wars that they felt they must fight, so they were really concerned about the fitness of their young men. Even though when I say they went to war, when they went to war, every able-bodied man went to war, including their old men, young and old alike. Hardly anyone was exempt. And I've told you how that Euripides, after running 150 miles, was expected to fight in a battle and then run the 26 miles to Athens, fought the Battle of Marathon, and it was just too much for him. But they believed that they should not complain, that no matter how badly they were hurting, they should push on and push on. And Euripides pushed on until he had killed himself. Zeus had a very jealous wife named Hera. Or Juno. I'll call her Greek name. And now, one thing, each city-state had its own god, as I already mentioned. Athena was the chief goddess of wisdom and philosophy. And of course, Athens was her city. Athens was named after her chief goddess. Aphrodite, otherwise known as Venus, was a goddess of love and fertility and sex and good crops. Now, the Greeks did not distinguish between the heavenly bodies. Sparta's main god was the god of war, Ares, whom the Romans called Mars. The Greeks did not distinguish between the heavenly bodies and the planet. Now, if you look up Mars today, you will run into, on the one hand, it's a planet. On the other hand, it's the ancient Roman god of war. When the Greeks looked up in the sky and saw Mars in its red color, they believed they were actually seeing the real god Mars. And when they saw Jupiter in the sky, and folks, you can see Jupiter right now in the night sky, it's a blue. You can really tell it if you look at it through binoculars, because that with binoculars, all these planets will start to expand in size a little bit. The stars still look like points of light until you get a super, super, super large telescope. Then the stars begin to expand in size. But otherwise, the stars always look like points of light. But the planets will show their shape as planet. I mean, it will show you that they're planets. Mars is more red than the others. Also, some people say the planets do not blink, the stars do. I can never tell the difference. Well, maybe my eyes aren't that good. But yes, I do have a telescope at home, and I have looked at Jupiter and seen its bands, and never seen more than 2 of its moons at a time. Well, the Greeks believed that the big bright blue star in the sky, the second in brightness only to Venus, was the real, honest to goodness Zeus. So in other words, there was no doubt that Zeus existed. I mean, you know, you could look right at the sky and see it. There he was. And again, no doubt that Mars existed at certain times in the year. He was in the night sky. Now, of course, any of you who know anything about astronomy know that Jupiter is not visible every night. It goes 6 months of the year when it can't be seen in the night sky, and 6 months in the year when it can. And where it is in the sky depends. The Greeks gave the term wandering stars to a planet because a planet will roam about from constellation to constellation, whereas the other stars stay fixed. So when the Greeks looked at the night sky, they would see the stars located pretty much in the same place we do, except for the North Star. The Earth is tilted slightly, where the North Star they saw is not the same as our Polaris today. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, yeah, okay. A few heads are nodding, yeah. The North Star has, I mean, it's not that the stars, you know, the Earth is tilted on its axis a little bit in a few thousand years. But the other stars remain pretty much in the same position today that the Greeks saw them. The fastest of all the gods was Hermes, or the Romans called him Mercury. Yes? That what? The Star of David? No, the Jews do not worship the North Star. No. In fact, some of the Jewish kings did worship the planets, and they were soundly condemned by the Jewish prophets for that. But yes, sometimes, from time to time, the Jews, we might say, lapsed. The Mercury, of course, is the fastest body in the solar system. Seems to move from place to place pretty fast, which it actually does. All right, now, the Greeks also believed in Titans. The Titans were the giants from past days, and folk, as far as I know, every ancient people, including the Jews, believed that the earth once was inhabited by giants. The Greeks also believed, as did as far as I know all ancient peoples, that these gods sometimes cohabited with earth women. All of you know that Hercules, his father was Zeus. I mean, this is ancient folklore. I'm not saying you have to believe it, but nevertheless, the fact is the Greeks did believe it. There is another story that Apollo, the sun god, or Apollo, had a son by an earth woman, and this son one day wanted to drive his father's chariot across the sky, and he could not handle the horse. His horse got out of control, and Jupiter had to shoot a lightning bolt and kill Apollo's son. And you have ever heard of these stories? I mean, with a few heads or not. If these mythologies, I mean, and there are persons now who say that these mythologies are in fact describing actual events that occurred at one time or another, that perhaps a passing body that passed through the solar system, a small white dwarf star passed through the solar system and made it look like it was the sun for a while because it was really bright. And it was the same one that tilted Uranus. And if you know anything about the planets, the planet Uranus is tilted 90 degrees on its side. Now, a few of you nodding your head like you have heard that before. That Uranus was not formed that way. It was tilted as a result of some kind of catastrophe. The Greeks also had a story that Venus was born from the head of Jupiter. All right, now how could this be? Well, simply this. The Greeks might have observed one day that, assuming that Venus was once a planet of Jupiter, and some people believe that it might have been, that something caused Venus to break away from Jupiter, and the Greeks actually observed the planet Venus breaking off from the orbit of Jupiter and heading toward its present orbit, which gave birth to the myth that Venus was born from the head of Jupiter. Now, some people believe that these explanations actually explain things, events that the Greeks might actually, or the ancients might actually have observed, events that might actually have happened at one time or another. That they were not just fanciful stories that were made up, but they were describing something that we in the modern world ought to pay more attention to, that it might benefit us if we could. All right, I'll pause here. Anybody have any comments, questions? Again, I'm going to quote my teacher here. He said, if I were sitting in your shoes, I would have a whole lot of questions right now. Dr. Bing was his name. He was at University of Tennessee, and he asked if any of us had any questions. Nobody said a word. Yeah, I know. I once sat in your place also. Now, oracles. The Greeks believed that they could go to certain oracles. There were two oracles going on in this time. One was in the desert of Egypt, and one was at Delphi. There were certain places. Now, the Greeks believed that if you went to the oracle of Delphi with a question, you could receive a divine answer from Apollo. The oracle of Delphi was an oracle to Apollo, or the sun god. And Apollo would communicate his wishes to mankind. Now, I'll give you an example now of what the oracle of Delphi. The emperor of Lydia went to the oracle of Delphi one time, and the emperor of Lydia was told, if you go to war against the Persians, you'll destroy a great empire. So the king of Lydia went to war against the Persian empire, and it was his own empire that was destroyed and not the Persian empire. Philip of Macedon went to the oracle of Delphi to get advice on attacking the Persians, and the oracle said, the bull has been slain, the sacrifice is ready. Well, Philip interpreted this to mean that the bull was a Persian empire and it was already slain, so Persia was ready to be sacrificed. Instead, he was slain, and he was the sacrifice. Another time, Philip went to the oracle of Delphi to get an answer to question. The question that disturbed him was, am I the father of my son Alexander? And the oracle answered him, honor Zeus with all your mind, with all your heart, and the eye with which you peeked in on your wife and saw a serpent. I'm jumping around this a little bit, but Philip of Macedon had peeked in through a keyhole to his wife's room and saw a large serpent slither up to his wife's bed. And he had reason to fear that he was not the father of Alexander. The oracle said that the eye with which you saw the serpent you're going to lose. Within 2 years that eye was put out in battle, and he spent the rest of his life with only one eye. Now, the point I'm trying to make is these oracles, when they gave an answer, the answer was usually very vague and indefinite. Well, what's the weather going to be today? Well, it's going to rain unless it doesn't. Or there might be some sleet and snow out unless the temperature stays too warm. In that case, it's only going to be rain. I mean, I'm not knocking our weathermen. That's the best they can do. We thought, we got satellites and computers. Galore, and now every weather station has hundreds of them. And each one of them is programmed slightly differently, and each one of them comes up with slightly different results. And we don't know any more about the future of the weather than we did when I was a kid. All right, but anyway, but at least we're not trying to be soothsayers. I'm just a folk. These oracles fell out of disuse at some point. And it was not because the people didn't like the answers. Now, this might be more for theology class than it is for history, but I don't care. I'm going to give you the oracles simply are known to stop answering, stop communicating. And therefore, the people stopped going to them. Today, these oracles are completely in ruins, and everybody today thinks, oh, it was a bunch of fakery and quackery and malarkey. We'll have a little bit more to say about these as time went on. As we go on. What happened as time went on. Now again, when I was in graduate school, I studied Greek history. The Greeks eventually became skeptical of these gods. And for the first time in history, some well-known philosopher came right out and said, there's something that Confucius did not do, and something that Buddha never did. But he said, now as for these gods that you people worship, I don't know whether they exist or not. Again, the Greeks, like I mentioned in the first part of last class, they were like us, and they had among them religious skeptics. People who were not sure if the gods existed, or if they even had a few atheists among them, persons who said they were convinced that the gods did not exist. Now, there was a progression from the more spiritual to the more mundane. And if you notice, my hand went down when I called it more mundane, because that's personally what I believe about it. That it was a progression downward. But there was a progression from the spiritual to the more, but eventually the progression stopped. And later generations of Greece became super extremely religious. And I'll tell you something, I'm old enough to observe. A lot of times when parents are skeptics, they'll have children who become religious extremists. At least when the parents are religious extremists, and a lot of times the children become unbelievers. It goes back and forth from when the Greeks experienced this too. They call it, I'm not going to ask you to learn this term, the failure of the nerve, where they have intellectual freedom for a while, free from the constraints of religion and theology, and the next thing you can't stand the intellectual, you just dive head first into deep theology of all kinds and all shapes and all forms. This is what the Greeks wound up doing. And we'll talk more about some of this later as we come to it, about some of these stages that the religion went through. But before we do, we'll get back to religion. We'll talk about the Greeks wrote history. Now, I want to clarify something. The historian who is called the father of history is Herodotus. H-E-R. Herodotus was a general who failed, so he went into exile, and while he failed, he wrote the history of the whole world of mankind, and most of what we know about Persian history comes from him. He wrote about Jewish history. Yeah, he mentioned the Jewish kings, King Hezekiah and the Assyrian army invading Jerusalem. He mentions that. Yeah, most of what we know about the history of Persia comes from him. He wrote about Assyria, Babylon, and he wrote Greek history also. He is called the father of history. And I used to wonder why. I thought, well, didn't the Jews write a history of the whole world? Yes, but here's what the modern day historians like about Herodotus. He tended to leave out more of the divine elements or the spiritual elements than other historians before him had. And therefore today's historians tend to like him. For instance, in describing the history of Messenia, you look up Messenia on the web and you'll find that the Greeks said that there was an early Messenian man who could transform himself into the shape of a serpent and then transform himself into the shape of an ox. And well, today's historians don't believe that. But nevertheless, the Greeks appear to have believed it. Well, Herodotus left this kind of stuff out. Herodotus was more natural. Then after Herodotus, Herodotus wrote a history of the world as best as he had records of it. There came Thucydides. He came after Herodotus. He was also a historian, but he was even more mundane, in other words, less spiritual than Herodotus had been. I mean, Herodotus left a little bit of, you might say, spiritual or supernatural elements into his history. Thucydides threw it all out. Now, again, this was because in the Thucydides generation, the Greeks were becoming more and more skeptical of the Olympian deities. They're more and more skeptical, perhaps, of religion in general. So there was a progression here. Far less religious, Thucydides was, and Herodotus. The Greeks also are the first people we know of who practiced what we call drama. A lot of their drama, now again, Greek plays are still put on in theaters. A lot of their drama were what we call tragedies. Now, when I was a kid and I'd watch Western shows, I used to wonder, how could the Lone Ranger get into so many fights after fight after fight and come back the next show completely healed and completely well? And it seemed like the top guy never got killed. And in most cases he didn't. Well, a tragedy is a story where the hero gets killed. And most of the time it was because of fate. His fate had been predicted by the gods at birth, and nothing could be done about it. One of the more famous tragedies is the tragedy of Achilles, which I mentioned. Achilles, whose mother dipped him into the river Styx to make him invulnerable, except she didn't dip his heel in. So he wound up getting shot with a poisoned arrow in his heel. Yeah, your Achilles heel is, I mean, you sometimes hear Achilles mentioned in the context of a football team. One year, the University of Georgia's Achilles heel was its offensive line. Its offensive line just didn't seem to be good enough to win an SEC game. Achilles heel is your weak spot. Again, there's the other more famous, equally famous story, perhaps, is a story of Oedipus. Oedipus was told that, at birth, that God said he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. Well, so his father banished him, but he came back and unknowingly killed the king. His father was a king. He killed the king and married the queen to get the throne, not knowing the queen was his mother, and the person he had killed was actually the king he killed was actually his father. Again, have you ever run into these stories in your Greek or your literature classes, or several heads are nodding? Have you heard these stories before? The Greeks practiced a form of drama. Again, this made them different from other people. I will get into the math later, but before I do, I want to get into art. The most conspicuous feature of Greek art is their temples. They've developed several kinds of columns. I mean, at the top of their column, they would put some kind of various kinds of design. Now, I'm not going to ask me, Roberts, there was this type of column, and then this column that, like so, the columns, of course, supported temples. The temple to Athena in Athens did not have any walls. It had the columns that supported the roof, and it had a roof. So you could go inside and get shelter from the rain, but the temperature inside was the same as the temperature outside. And again, the problem with all these stone structures was after a while the stone began to crumble, and there was no repair to it. So a lot of these structures still stand to this day, even after more than 2,000 years, but they stand as ruins. Now, there was another feature of Greek art. Greek art strove for realism. Now, if you take art today, and I have a documentary art, they'll say, leave realism to the camera. The idea today is to paint emotions, to paint feelings. But the Greeks prided themselves that they could make a statue of an apple that was so real that a deer would come up and try to eat the apple. I mean, it had the right kind of paints, even the right kind of colors, the exact right shape, and they believed they could actually entice a deer to eat the apples that they made. And they strove for this kind of realism. So again, today's art discourages that. Now, they also strove for the ideal male body. Now, of course, nobody knows what that body really is, but I'm going to get into that in a minute. When I was a youngster, I was 11 years old, and one of my classmates asked me, why do these Greek statues always show their gods naked? I did not know the answer to that. Today I do know. The Greeks believed that these gods had the ideal body that everybody should emulate. Big body, they had a big broad shoulders and very muscular biceps and muscular all over and a slender waist. The ideal body has found its way into, yes, our comic books. Not that anybody reads them anymore, particularly the Superman comics. Now, when I was a kid, I'd read the Superman and Batman comics. And there was a man who'd advertised in every comic book. His name was Charles Atlas. And he claimed, I say claimed, that he could take anybody over 14, from 14 to 60, and create his type of body. Charles Atlas won the title of the world's most perfectly developed man. He claimed he could make anybody have the body of a Greek god. The ideal body was that of a Greek god. Today we know that unless you were born with the right genetic combination, you'll never get that kind of body, so don't attempt it. And besides, who's to say what the ideal body is anyway? I had one student ask me that. We don't know. But Adolf Hitler believed that the ideal body was the body of a Greek god. He was going to create a race of Aryans where every male would look like Superman. And Superman, the word comes from Nietzsche, who believed that, along with Hitler, that by the right type of breeding and the right type of exercise, you could create a race of Superman. And the Superman, basically was the next step up in our evolution. Our evolution had gotten us from monkey-like ancestors to humans, and from human we're going to evolve into persons with higher mental and physical abilities. I want to say this about evolution. For every species you ever tried, the descendants will get to a certain boundary and they never cross that boundary, and the next generation will bounce right back more toward the mainstream. Now, some of you don't know what I'm talking about. There's a certain type of tropical fish called the guppy. The guppy in South America, when you find the ugly old gray guppies, but you can selectively breed them and get really nice, fancy looking guppies that can make your aquarium look really beautiful. If you let them randomly breed, they're going to revert back to the ugly gray guppy that you find in the South American creek. They don't evolve into amphibians or lizards or anything else. Anybody have a comment? It looked to me like most of you were wide awake and listening. I appreciate it. All right. Anyway, well, hey, they try to breed racehorses. The best racehorse that was ever bred was Secretariat. Secretariat's grandfather won a Triple Crown. His father never amounted to much. But Secretariat was bred on a bet. So one person said, I'll get the pick and you get what's left. So two horses were bred together. The one person picked the first horse, and it turned out to be a mare that couldn't even outrun their accountants. Oh, they said, this mare is really pretty and really gentle, but it can't run. The other horse was Secretariat, who still holds the record for the fastest time that was ever recorded on the third race of the Triple Crown. Secretariat was the father of some 500 horses they hoped would beat his record. And what happened? Secretariat hit, like you might say, hit the boundary, and his descendants have all bounced back toward the mainstream. Never transgressed the boundary. It was like he was as far as you could go in getting a racehorse that could race a short distance on a dirt track, and was good for absolutely nothing else. The better they are, the horses are in one aspect of their existence, the worse they are in everything else. A racehorse cannot work, a workhorse cannot race. They breed racehorses to do really well on a mile and or maybe a 3/4 of a mile to a mile and a quarter dirt track, usually in dry weather. Now, American Pharoah, American Pharoah won its second race in a really, really sloppy wet track. Super wet. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Oh yeah. American Pharoah almost equaled Secretariat's record in the third race. Almost. All right, anyway, the Greeks believed that they could create the ideal body, and that's what they strove for in the statue of their gods. All right, now, let's see. Now, I am getting to a big topic here. All right, I do want to mention something about their science. The Greeks had the beginning of what we might call science. Pythagoras came out with what we call the Pythagorean theorem. Hopefully all of you know this. If this side equals 3, and this side equals 4, and this is a right angle, what's this side going to equal? 5. Yeah. It's the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, some of you might not. But anyway, it's a mathematical term. Pythagoras, 3, 4, and 5. Now, there's another geometric figure that Plato really liked. If this side is a right angle, And if this is right, and if this is 60 degrees, and this is 30, and the base is 1, what would the hypotenuse be? 30, 60, 90 degree triangle. The base is 1, the hypotenuse will always be 2. Yeah, I think I heard somebody say that earlier. Yeah, twice, the hypotenuse is twice the base. And what would this side be? This side would be 0.816. I have to memorize that many years ago. This side would be 0.816. This side would be, wait, that's not quite right. That's actually 1.6. This side would be 1.6. This side would be 2. This side would be 1. The hypotenuse says a 30, 60, 90 degree angle triangle is twice the base. How many of you knew what I was talking about here? I mean, okay, several hands are going up. All right. Yeah, all right, the Greeks gave us that. Now we come to really what I think is my favorite part of Greek, the philosophers. Start off with the sophist. The sophist, and folk, I had a teacher who said that studying these philosophies will kind of shake your mind up. I don't intend to do that. A lot of what they discuss then really seems silly to us in view of our technological advances, in view of what we know about the universe that they could only dream of. But the sophists said, we'll never understand the universe. Such understanding is beyond humans anyway. Now transfer to the year 2016, and there are some scientists who are about to say that there's some phenomena that we will never explain. I'm not, of course, the difference between me and them is I think it's okay to try. Who knows what we might figure out? We can try. But what can we actually learn? We won't know till we try. But there might always wind up being some things about our universe we will never explain. The sophists stressed rhetoric or persuasive speech making. They stressed winning debates. Now I want to give you an example of rhetoric. Two men in American history knew each other. They lived in the same colony. Their names were Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. They were both against the British. One of them was great into rhetoric, the other one into logic. I'll start with Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he said, all right, now, he has, referred to the King of England, he has dissolved our legislative assemblies. He has appointed governors over us without our consent. He has appointed judges over us without our consent. He has quartered troops in our homes, private homes in peacetime, without the consent of the owner. He has, over and over again, he has this. He has taken our people to England for trial without our consent, and where that nobody knows them, and where the family cannot witness or vouch for them. He has done all this bad stuff, the king had. Now, Patrick Henry, talk about the same thing. Our chains are already forged. You can hear their clanking on the plains of Boston. Is life so sweet or peace so dear to be purchased with the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Now, I'm not using the same volume. I understand Patrick Henry did. If I did, I'm sure there'd be security guards coming in the room when it happened. So he got so loud that he could be heard outside the building and in the street. And he later the next day apologized for the volume in his voice. But you see the difference. The one man was using substance, and the other was using rhetoric. The King of England never really intended to enslave the colonials. But the sophists, I mean, they were into rhetoric. Substance, who knows what substance is? The way of the universe, we can't explain it. Now, the sophists also were great at saying there are no absolutes. Now, folk, this is what's called an oxymoron. It's impossible. Here's why. I mean, I had a student some years back tell me, there are no absolutes. Well, if this statement is, if there are no absolutes, then this must be an absolute. But wait, there are none. That means there must be absolutes. You follow the logic. Yeah. In other words, it's an impossibility. No absolutes. I mean, even Einstein in his theory of relativity had two things that were not relative: the speed of light and the interval. Now, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Time interval was always constant. The speed of light was always constant. So there were absolutes even in the theory of relativity. But the sophists believed that there were no absolutes. But this was an absolute statement. Well, wait a minute. If this is an absolute statement, how can you say there are no absolutes? It's called an oxymoron. An oxymoron is like an honest liar, an honest thief, a truthful liar, a sinful saint. All right, now we come to Socrates. When I was at UT, my graduate professor devoted a whole 50-minute lecture to Socrates. Anyway, we won't devote that long to him, I promise you. I became fascinated with Socrates 2 years before I started teaching here, beginning in 1998. And from time to time, I'll look him up. All right, he believed that the answer to every question lay within us. And all it would take would be somebody asking us to get it out. Now, if it sounds absurd, folks, don't worry about it. I mean, it sounds absurd to me, too. I'm married to a newspaper editor, person, and I tell her, don't be a reporter around your family. She'll ask me a question I can only answer vaguely, indefinitely. And if that answer is not good enough, she'll ask again. I say, hey, you're not going to get a better answer than that out of me. I don't have one. I can't give you one. If I could, I would, but I can't give you a better answer than the vague, indefinite answer I've already given you. Now, something else, folks. Now, you may not need to know. If you don't know this, don't worry about it. But how tightly do the nuts on the cylinder head of your car need to be torqued? If you don't know, don't worry about it. You don't need to know. Do you know? How tightly do the cylinder head nuts on your car need to be torqued? It might be. I don't know. Here's the reason. That's important. Here's why. If you don't torque all these nuts evenly, if one nut gets hit more hard when this piston comes up than the other ones, that engine is going to come apart. Yeah, you know what? You have to torque them. And the engineers who spent years and years studying this have decided, yeah, and when I was walking, we had to know, we had to write down every nut on the plane had a certain pressure had to be torqued at. That was essential to torque it right. I knew a man who was a home mechanic and tried to torque a nut the wrong way on his car and destroyed a new part he just bought about a week before, and they asked him, what do you torque it to? Well, it was wrong. So, this is important. Now, what I'm saying is, if you don't know the answer, all the questioning anyone can ask you is not going to get it out of you. It's not in there. That's the point I might already have made. But Socrates believed that the answer to every question lay within us, and if you started to ask, so Socrates would meet people on their way to court and ask them questions, particularly to ask them, hey, are you sure your case is a better? And he would try to convince everybody that their case was the worst case. And he used to say, he got a lot of people angry at him. People who are on their way to court don't want to hear that, hey, you're wrong and the other person is right. And again, in Socrates' case, no matter which side the person he was talking to was always wrong. That may explain something of what wound up happening to him. But he questioned everything the Athenians believed, including their religion. That's why some people call him a free thinker. They said he questioned the existence of the old gods. He believed that no one was intentionally evil, that evil was only the result of ignorance, that education could cure the problem of evil. And if you notice, I just had to make a face when I said that. But, hey, there's some things I don't believe, so having said that, I'll wash my mouth out. No, education will not cure the problem of evil. It reminds me of two men sitting in prison one day, and one of them said to the other, when I get out, I'm going to college. And while you're still a petty thief, I will become an extortionist. You're going to be a thief on this level, I'm going to be a thief on this level. But we're both going to be morally bankrupt. But he believed education would solve the problem of evil. The idea was to train people. Socrates might have gotten a lot of his ideas from the Egyptian initiates. It's known that Pythagoras and Solon and Socrates went to Egypt, and Plato also. Yeah, but must be Plato. These men went to Egypt and might have gotten a lot of their ideas from the Egyptian priest. I've talked about the priests already, and these priests might have imparted some of their ideas. Now, folk, if you were researching Socrates, 4 out of 5 websites you'll come to will not mention what I'm about to say. 4 out of 5. But I feel like it's extremely imperative that I mention this. Socrates told the world that he was buddy-buddies with a demon. Now, this demon supposedly kept him from doing wrong. Now, all right, I want to say this. The Muslims call them genie. 90 to 95% of the world's people have believed, and probably do believe, maybe secretly, that there are invisible spirit beings that float around and have the ability to implant suggestions into a person's mind, or tempt people to do wrong, entice people to make a really bad decision. You can believe what you want to, but Socrates claimed that he actually visited this demon one time in his palace, where this demon was waited on by servants, and this demon was constantly whispering things in his ear. Today's psychologists and psychiatrists say that this shows that Socrates was suffering from a type of epilepsy. Again, Julius Caesar was said to be epileptic, and I'll say this about epilepsy. It runs really close to me. My grandma Cunningham was epileptic. I learned that from my great aunt. My dad might have died without knowing that about his mother, because she only lived 26. My grandmother only lived 26 years and died when my dad was 6. So he might not have known that she was that way. But anyway, he claimed to be friends with a demon. Now here's what they, all right, open up. This topic I'm about to bring up. If you think I'm fearful, bring it up. You're right, I am very much. But what this demon was supposedly keeping Socrates from was the young boys. The Greeks, and this is what we'll talk about when we get to Greek family life. The Greeks considered male homosexuality to be ideal. Every Greek man had his wife, because he had to carry on the family name, and he had to give his estate to his legitimate offspring. But most of your Greek upper classes had a boy. Socrates believed that this was wrong. Nevertheless, he claimed that these young boys would come after him. Now again, if you look at his picture, again, this is before Hollywood. But he claimed that this demon would whisper in your ear to keep him from these boys. Socrates had the tendency towards homosexuality, which he fought hard against and might have overcome. He married. He had 3 sons. We know the name of his wife. We know the names of his sons. And as far as we know, he lived a life that was fairly morally upright. Now, this is leads up to the other. I've told you about how the progression went from extremely spiritual to more and more material. Socrates has been called a free thinker, but if you ask me, he was one of the most spiritually minded men who ever lived. There was nothing much free thinking about him. He claimed that his morality and his judgments were guided by an unseen demon. He taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But there's another progression there, the progression about homosexuality. Socrates believed it was wrong and fought it, tried to overcome it. Plato came along and Plato said it's all right. Then Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle didn't even discuss it. Aristotle was no longer an issue anymore. Didn't even discuss whether it was right or wrong. He just soon. In the case of Aristotle, Aristotle said, and your book says this too, he looked on women as being completely, totally useless, except they had one useful function, that was to bear children, to carry on the human. Otherwise, the men and women were utterly, totally, and completely useless. This, folk, again, in no way do I condone this myself, in no way do I. But this was the progression. Progression from being straight to being gay. Yeah, all right, yes.
So what about Alexander the Great?
Alexander the Great is believed to have been homosexual himself. Yeah, that's, again, Alexander's mother would continually criticize his father, Philip Macedon, and run him down, and Alexander developed a strong attachment to his mother, which gave him into that, and a hatred for his father. And Alexander has been accused of being involved in killing his father. We do not know how true that actually is. All right, anyway, Socrates, I'll leave that subject for now. I will get back to when we come to Greek family life. Of course, there won't be much more to say about it. But there was this tendency in the Greek society where that the particularly aristocratic men wanted to have a boy in their life as well as their wife. Socrates is famous for the statement, "Know thyself." It could sound as being one of the greatest statements of all time, except for one thing: it's impossible. All right, I'm going to jump now to the end of this part of the story. Oh, wait, one other thing. He believed that the ideal government was the government of the philosopher king. Keep in mind, he grew up in a democracy. He could not stand democracy. Now, one time, many years ago, I went to a website where this website was a professor who was the world's top expert on Socrates, up at MIT, I believe. There's someplace like that. And he said everywhere he goes, people find he's expert on Socrates. They always ask him this question. He says, well, I'm going to put this statement online that he actually supposedly has said. Socrates is famous for the statement that when you give people too much freedom, after a while they start demanding order. So here's what Socrates allegedly said. I can't quote it verbatim, but he said, in the city of Athens, the beasts do not obey their masters. The mule does not move when his master tells him to. The horse does not go where his master tells him to. The children do not obey their parents. The wife, the husband never knows where she is. The husband and wife get up and go their separate ways, and then they might come together. Nobody knows when the other one is coming home or what the other one's doing while they're away from home. Everybody lives in complete, total independence of any kind of moral and social norm. And the result is Athens is in chaos. Therefore, he said, he is an admirer of, I'll be right with you, he was an admirer of Sparta. Just like a lot of American intellectuals have been admirers of the Soviet Union or admirers of communism. Yes?
Well, also, he was like really high class aristocrat, wasn't he?
All right,
So
we
he
have
was,
three,
like,
I'm glad we have, I saw that on the web. We have three original sources, one by Thucydides, one by Plato, and one by Xenophon. And they all three give a different idea about his birth and the class. One has him high class, another one has him starting out in poverty. The fact is, we cannot tell. Was he high class? Was he not? Again, from the original sources, Xenophon, Thucydides, and Plato, we cannot tell. But,
he eventually rose to a higher class, right?
yes, he was. By profession, he was said to be a glass blower. I mean, that's one, at least according to one account. In other words, he could blow bottles and put bottles to, he was a glass blower, or make even human shapes out of bottles. He, basically, he was an artist of sorts. And now, folk, I'm just about out of time. I'm going to get to this, and then we'll quit. The people of Athens stood him as long as they could, and finally they called him into court. He went before the Council of 500 on the charge of corrupting the youth. And folk, now that I'm a parent, I can understand this better than I once could. When you become a parent, you want your children to have your values as much as possible. And you're concerned, well, my children believe in the same religion I do, or my children, and I'll tell you something. First of all, I crossed the street.